February 14, 1967, Route 44 cuts through Phuoc to province like a scar through green flesh. The air hangs thick, motionless, weighted with moisture that makes breathing feel like drowning. 4 men move through the rubber plantation bordering the highway. They make no sound, not the crack of a twig, not the whisper of fabric against bark, not even the rhythm of breath disturbs the jungle's silence. They are Australian SAS, and they are hunting something American intelligence has been searching for and failing to find for 3 years. 20 meters from the road, Sergeant Jack Morrison freezes. His hand rises, fingers spread. The patrol stops instantly, each man becoming part of the landscape, invisible even to eyes that know where to look. Through the rubber trees, figures emerge onto Route 44. Or are they? Morrison watches. He does not move. He does not blink. His breathing slows to the point of stillness. He has been in this position for 47 minutes. He will remain for as long as necessary. This is what separates the Australian SAS from every other unit in Vietnam. This is patience weaponized. This is intelligence gathering that will expose a network the Viet Cong believed untouchable. Subscribe to Vietnam War Records now to uncover the classified operations that changed how wars are fought. Hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The taxation point Morrison is observing is operated in plain sight for 32 months. 3 American divisions passed through this province. Thousands of patrols, hundreds of operations. Yet no one found what 4 Australians discovered in less than a week. The Viet Cong called it Thu Thu, the collection. Every farmer traveling Route 44 stopped at this precise location. They surrendered rice. They surrendered money. They surrendered information. The system was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its efficiency. American intelligence knew the Viet Cong were taxing the population. What they did not know was how, where the collectors positioned themselves, how they communicated, where they disappeared afterward, who the enforcers were, which villages were willing participants and which were coerced. The Americans flew reconnaissance aircraft overhead. They saw nothing. They deployed ground patrols. The taxation stopped during operations, resumed the moment patrols departed. They interrogated prisoners. No one talked, no one knew. No one survived long enough to inform. This was not a failure of resources. The United States military in 1967 possessed technological superiority that should have rendered guerrilla infrastructure obsolete. They had helicopters, jets, artillery, electronic surveillance equipment, thousands of personnel, billions of dollars. What they lacked was what Morrison possessed in abundance: time, silence, understanding. Morrison's patrol had been inserted 6 days earlier, 8 kilometers north of their current position. They moved differently than American units. Where American patrols covered ground, Australian SAS disappeared into it. They did not march through the jungle. They inhabited it, became indistinguishable from it. Their packs carried rations for 3 weeks. They could remain in position for days without resupply. They wore no aftershave, no deodorant, nothing with artificial scent. They moved at rates that shocked their American counterparts, sometimes 300 meters per hour through dense vegetation, not because they moved slowly, but because they stopped constantly, observing, listening, ensuring nothing detected their presence. The Viet Cong had an expression for Australian SAS patrols: Ma Run, ghosts of the jungle. Not men, not soldiers. Spirits, apparitions that materialized behind you without sound, without warning, without mercy. The nickname was earned. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian SAS would achieve kill ratios exceeding 100 to 1. In some documented operations, ratios reached 500 to 1. These numbers seem impossible until you understand the method. Australian SAS did not fight like Americans. They did not engage unless conditions guaranteed victory. They gathered intelligence. They tracked. They observed. And when they struck, it was surgical, devastating, final. Morrison's training began not in Vietnam but in Malaya, where Australian forces spent 12 years defeating communist insurgents in what history would record as one of the few successful counterinsurgency campaigns. The Malayan Emergency, from 1948 to 1960, taught lessons the Americans never learned. It taught that superior firepower meant nothing in jungle warfare, that patience defeated aggression, that understanding the enemy's infrastructure mattered more than destroying his battalions, that guerrilla wars are won by intelligence, not artillery. The British and Australians in Malaya developed tactics specifically designed for jungle environments: silent movement, close observation, small unit operations, integration with local populations, denial of resources to systematic dismantling of shadow governments. When the first Australian SAS squadron deployed to Vietnam in 1966, they brought these lessons. The Americans brought helicopters. The difference in results was immediate and stark. The Viet Cong taxation system Morrison observed was a masterpiece of organizational efficiency. It operated at every level of Vietnamese society, from international shipping routes down to individual farmers. At the village level, shadow governments mirrored official government structures. For every elected village chief, there was a Viet Cong village chief. For every district official, a VC counterpart. These shadow officials collected taxes, enforced discipline, gathered intelligence, recruited fighters, and maintained control. The system was so deeply embedded that villagers often could not identify who worked for the government and who worked for the Viet Cong. Sometimes the same person worked for both. The taxation funded everything: weapons purchases, rice for fighters, medical supplies, propaganda materials, salaries for cadre members. According to captured documents translated by the Combined Intelligence Center in 1967, 80 to 90% of Viet Cong operational budgets came from taxation. Rice tax was most important. Farmers surrendered 25 to 30% of their harvest. In some areas, the Viet Cong took everything except what families needed for survival. Transportation tax came second. Boats, trucks, carts, bicycles, anything that moved paid. Rates changed based on cargo, destination, and VC operational needs. A farmer with a cart of vegetables might pay in rice. A fishing boat might pay in fish and information. Everyone paid. Those who refused disappeared. Their families found bodies in rice paddies, throats cut, eyes removed, genitals mutilated. The message was clear: pay willingly or pay with your life. American intelligence knew this system existed. What they could not do was pay. The problem was not lack of effort. The CIA, Army Intelligence, the Combined Intelligence Center, the Phoenix program, all focused on identifying and eliminating VC infrastructure. They arrested thousands, interrogated tens of thousands, processed endless documents, radio intercepts, prisoner statements. Yet the taxation continued. Collections happened in broad daylight. American patrols passed within. Nothing changed. The failure was methodological. Americans approached Vietnam with American assumptions. They assumed visible military force deterred insurgent activity. They assumed superior technology overcame human intelligence networks. They assumed short-term operations produced long-term results. They assumed wrong. The Viet Cong did not fear American fire. They adapted to it. When helicopters appeared, they vanished. When artillery fired, they sheltered. When patrols swept through, Americans came and went. The Viet Cong remained. This was their country, their villages, their families. They had nowhere to go and infinite patience to wait. Morrison understood this. 6 days in the jungle taught him more than 6 months of briefings. He learned where people walked, which trails were used daily, which occasionally. He learned patterns. Morning activities differed from afternoon activity. Rainy season movement differed from dry season. He learned sounds, bird calls that signaled danger, monkey screams that meant human, the specific rustle of someone trying to move quietly versus someone moving naturally. He learned smells, cooking fires, tobacco, a particular odor of scared humans, the metallic scent that preceded rain. Most importantly, he learned patience. American patrols measured success in ground covered, contacts made, enemies killed. Morrison measured success in intelligence gathered. He was not here to fight. He was here to watch, learn, and report. If his patrol spent 3 weeks in the bush and never fired a shot but returned with detailed intelligence on enemy movements, taxation points, supply routes, and infrastructure personnel, the mission was a success. This philosophy was alien to American doctrine. U.S. military strategy in Vietnam centered on attrition. The theory was simple: kill enough enemy soldiers, and they will quit. General William Westmoreland, commanding U.S. forces from 1964 to 1968, implemented search and destroy operations designed to find and eliminate VC and North Vietnamese Army units. Large American formations, typically battalion or brigade strength, would sweep through areas believed to contain enemy forces. They would engage, call in artillery and air support, count bodies, and declare victory. The strategy failed for multiple reasons. First, the Viet Cong controlled when contact occurred. They initiated most engagements, fighting only when conditions favored them, withdrawing when outgunned. Second, body counts were notoriously unreliable. Pressure to show results led to inflated numbers. Civilian casualties counted as combatants, dead bodies counted multiple times. Third, and most critically, killing fighters did not damage taxation continued, recruitment continued. Even when Americans killed hundreds of VC in a single operation, the organization survived because its foundation, the infrastructure, remained untouched. The Australians understood this. They focused not on killing fighters, but on identifying infrastructure, cadre members, political officers, intelligence operatives, recruiters, the people who made the system function. Route 44 taxation point operated with mechanical precision. Morrison's patrol observed for 9 hours on February 14th, 17 hours on February 15th, 14 hours on February 16th. They documented everything. The collectors arrived separately, never together. 3 men, ages approximately 30 to 45. They wore civilian clothes, indistinguishable from any farmer. They carried no visible weapons. They positioned themselves at a bend in the road where vehicles naturally slowed. 1 man sat beneath a tree. 1 stood near a marker stone. The 3rd remained in the tree line, invisible from the road but positioned where he could observe approaching traffic. The system activated when vehicles approached. The man in the trees signaled. Hand gestures Morrison's team photographed with telephoto lenses. The roadside collectors moved to intercept. Conversations were brief. Money or goods changed hands. Some interactions lasted 30, some lasted 5 minutes. Occasionally, collectors waved vehicles through without payment. These were noted, either VC vehicles or people with special arrangements. After collections, the money and goods were hidden, not carried away immediately. Hidden in caches Morrison's team marked on maps. The collectors departed separately, at intervals, in different directions. Professional operational security. Harder to track multiple targets, harder to identify patterns, impossible for casual observers to but Morrison's team were not casual observers. They tracked all 3 collectors over the next 4 days. 1 returned to Hoa Long village, 2 kilometers south. 1 went to Bean Bar, 5 kilometers north. The 3rd disappeared into the rubber plantation east of Route 44. The 2 men followed the Hoa Long collector. 2 tracked the rubber plantation. Standard operating procedure for Australian SAS: never commit entire patrol to single target. Always maintain flexibility. Always keep options open. The Hoa Long collector led them to a house on the village's eastern edge. The house was unremarkable. Wood construction, thatched roof, garden with vegetables. Children playing outside. The collector entered, emerged 2 hours later carrying a different bag. He walked to the village market, purchased food, returned home. Normal civilian behavior. The patrol noted every detail: house location, family members, daily routines, entry and exit points, neighboring houses, sightlines, potential surveillance positions. They photographed the building from multiple angles using long-range lenses. They sketched the surrounding area. They noted times of activity, dawn routines, midday patterns, evening behaviors. This was intelligence work. Tedious, exhausting, absolutely critical. The rubber plantation target proved more interesting. He did not go to a village. He moved through the plantation for 3 kilometers, checking his surroundings constantly. Professional anti-surveillance techniques. He stopped frequently, observing his back trail. He varied his pace. He used terrain to mask his movement. He was trained. Morrison's 2-man team followed at extreme distance, sometimes losing visual contact for 20-minute periods. They did not panic. They did not rush. They used tracking skills learned in Malaya. Broken vegetation, disturbed leaf litter, bent grass recovering slowly, scuff marks on tree roots. The target led them to a small clearing deep in the plantation. Another man waited there. They talked briefly. The first man handed over a cloth bag, money from the taxation point. The second man disappeared north. The first man returned toward Route 44, using a different route. The patrol split again. 1 man followed the new target. 1 returned to Morrison. This was the network. Multiple layers, multiple handoffs, multiple security measures. Breaking 1 link would not break the chain. The Americans tried arresting tax collectors. Replacements appeared within days. The system was too large, too distributed, too resilient for direct action to destroy it. It required understanding, mapping, systematic targeting of not just individuals but the entire network. Morrison's patrol returned to base on February 22nd after 16 days in the field. They had not fired a single shot. They had not called in a single airstrike. By American standards, no contacts, no enemy killed, no terrain secured. But they carried something more valuable than body. They carried the map of a network, 37 individuals identified, 17 locations marked, 8 taxation points documented along a 20-kilometer stretch of road, election schedules noted, dead drop locations pinpointed, movement patterns traced, communication methods observed. Most critically, they identified the difference American intelligence missed. There was no central taxation authority. The system was distributed. Village-level collection points operated semi-independently, coordinated through couriers who moved intelligence and money between locations. Some collectors were hardcore Viet Cong. Some were villagers coerced into cooperation. Some were opportunists who worked both sides. Understanding these distinctions changed everything. Americans treated all VC infrastructure as enemy combatants to be killed. Australians recognized nuance. Hardcore cadre were targets. Coerced villagers were potential informants. Opportunists were pressure points that could turn. The intelligence Morrison brought back went to the Combined Intelligence Centre at 1st Australian Task Force headquarters at Nui Dat. Analysts cross-referenced it with reports from other patrols, prisoner interrogations, captured documents, South Vietnamese police intelligence. Patterns emerged. Route 44 was one of 11 active taxation corridors in Phuoc Tue province. The system generated an estimated 2 billion piastres annually, roughly $17 million. That funded 3 VC regiments plus D-445 battalion, the local force unit that operated continuously in the province. Destroying this system mattered more than killing fighters, because without funding, fighters could not eat, could not replace ammunition, could not recruit, could not survive. The Australians planned methodically. They did not raid taxation points. Raids were temporary. Replacements appeared. Instead, they initiated a campaign to dismantle the entire network across Phuoc Tue province over 8 months. The campaign combined military operations, police actions, psychological warfare, and civic programs. It was counterinsurgency done correctly, and it produced results that shocked American commanders who had spent 3 years failing at the same task. Phase 1 targeted infrastructure personnel, not through arrests but through identification. Australian SAS and infantry patrols conducted cordon and search operations in villages where tax collectors operated. They did not burst in with helicopters and artillery. They moved into position silently during night. At dawn, they sealed villages completely. No one entered, no one left. South Vietnamese police, accompanied by Australian intelligence officers and interpreters, then searched every building. They checked identification papers. They interrogated suspected VC members. They separated hardcore cadre from coerced villagers from neutral civilians. Operation Bundaberg, conducted in October 1966 against Hoa Long village, exemplified the method. Hoa Long was 2 kilometers south of the Australian base at Nui Dat. Intelligence indicated significant VC infrastructure operated within the village. Tax collectors, recruiters, intelligence operatives. On October 30th, 2 Australian battalions, 5 RA and 6 RA, plus elements of 3 SAS Squadron and 1st Armoured Personnel Carrier Squadron cordoned the village. They positioned soldiers every 30 meters around the entire perimeter. No one could leave undetected. South Vietnamese forces entered the village at dawn. They processed 3,756 civilians. They interrogated 630 suspects. They arrested 38 confirmed VC, 41 VC suspects, and 18 draft dodgers avoiding military service. Critically, they treated civilians respectfully. Medical teams provided treatment. Dental care was offered. Food was distributed. Psychological operations personnel showed movies and played music. The message was clear. The government is here to help. The Viet Cong bring violence. Choose sides. The distinction between this operation and American methods was profound. When U.S. forces cordoned villages, they often treated everyone as potential. Homes were searched roughly. Property was damaged. Civilians were screamed at, sometimes struck, frequently humiliated. This created resentment that drove villagers into VC arms. The Australians, trained in Malayan emergency tactics, understood that civilian support was the prize. They treated villagers like victims of VC oppression, which many were. Tax collectors extorted them. Recruiters took their sons. Intelligence operatives forced them to spy on government forces under threat of death. Many villagers hated the Viet Cong, but feared them too much to resist. Australian operations gave them protection. When government forces demonstrated they could provide security, neutralize VC threats, and offer better lives than insurgents provided, popular support shifted, slowly, incrementally, but decisively. Phase 2 targeted supply routes. SAS patrols identified trails used to move taxation proceeds from collection points to regional headquarters. These trails were ambushed, not with large forces that scared targets, with small teams that killed silently and vanished. A 4-man SAS patrol would position along a trail for days, waiting for high-value targets. When a courier carrying money or documents appeared, the patrol eliminated him. Quickly, silently. They took documents. They photographed everything. They withdrew without pursuit. The Viet Cong found bodies but no tracks leading away. No no evidence of who killed their people. The psychological impact was couriers became terrified. Some refused assignments. Some deserted. Some turned themselves into government forces, preferring imprisonment to the ghosts hunting them. The system began to fracture. Collections continued, but moving money became dangerous. Regional commanders stopped receiving full proceeds. Units went unpaid. Morale collapsed. The Americans had tried interdicting supply routes with massive operations. Battalion-sized sweeps that found nothing because the Viet Cong detected them miles away and avoided contact. The Australians used 4-man teams that enemies never saw coming. The difference in effectiveness was total. Phase 3 was civic action. While military operations dismantled VC infrastructure, civilian programs offered alternatives. The South Vietnamese government, advised by Australian civil affairs personnel, implemented revolutionary development programs in Phuoc Tuy province. Wells were dug. Medical clinics opened. Roads were repaired. Markets were constructed. Rice production increased because farmers no longer surrendered 30% of harvests to VC collectors. This was not charity. It was strategic. The Viet Cong promised better lives under communist rule, but when government forces provided security and services, the promise rang hollow. Why risk death for distant revolution when immediate improvement was available? The Americans tried similar programs, strategic hamlets, civic action, but implemented them poorly. They built infrastructure without providing security, so the Viet Cong destroyed it. They relocated villagers without compensation, breeding resentment. They failed to coordinate military and civilian efforts, so combat operations undermined civic programs. The Australians, with Australian Task Force Commander consulting directly with Province Chief Lieutenant Colonel Leduc Dat, integrated everything. Military operations created secure zones, police eliminated VC infrastructure, civic programs filled vacuums with government services. It was holistic, comprehensive, and it worked. By late 1967, the taxation system in Phuoc Tuy province was broken. Route 44 collections ceased completely. Route 2 collections dropped by 75%. Route 15 was secure enough that civilian traffic increased 5-fold. Captured documents from D445 Battalion complained bitterly about lack of supplies, inability to replace losses, low morale, defections. A November 1967 CIA report noted, Viet Cong units in Phuoc Tuy province are having supply problems and losing control of the population. This was not accidental. This was the result of systematic dismantling of infrastructure through intelligence-driven operations. Americans in other provinces achieved nothing comparable. In 1968, when the Tet Offensive erupted across South Vietnam, Pho Tuy province remained relatively quiet. The Viet Cong lacked resources to mount major attacks. Their supply networks too disrupted, their popular support too eroded. Australian methods prevented what happened elsewhere. The differences between Australian and American approaches were doctrinal, cultural, and experiential. American doctrine emphasized firepower. Overwhelming force applied decisively to destroy enemy formations. This worked in conventional warfare. It failed against insurgencies. When you bomb a village to kill 10 VC fighters, you create 50 new VC sympathizers among survivors. When you measure success by body counts, you incentivize killing anyone to inflate numbers. When you rotate personnel every 12 months, No one develops local knowledge or long-term relationships. The system guaranteed failure. Australian doctrine, shaped by Malayan emergency success, emphasized intelligence, patience, and population control. You cannot kill your way to victory in counterinsurgency. You must understand the enemy's structure, systematically dismantle it, and replace it with functional government. This requires time, cultural sensitivity, and willingness to use minimum force necessary. It requires soldiers who speak local languages, understand local customs, and build trust with civilians. It requires thinking 10 years ahead, not 10 days. Culturally, Australians approached Vietnam differently than Americans. America saw Vietnam as frontline in global war against communism, existential ideological struggle, domino theory in action. Australia saw Vietnam as regional stability issue, prevent communist expansion in Southeast Asia but without messianic overtones. This difference manifested in soldier behavior. American troops often viewed Vietnamese as inferior, primitive, untrustworthy. Racial slurs were common. Civilians were gooks or slopes. Villages were obstacles to clear, not populations to win. Australian troops, having worked alongside Asian forces in Malaya and elsewhere, showed more respect. They learned basic Vietnamese, they attended local ceremonies, they played soccer with village children. They took time to explain military operations to village chiefs. Small, massive impact. When villagers trusted Australians more than Americans, they provided better intelligence. When they saw Australians as protectors rather than occupiers, they stopped sheltering Viet Cong. Experientially, Australian forces brought 12 years of jungle warfare expertise from Malaya. They knew how to move silently, how to track enemies through dense vegetation, how to read terrain, weather, vegetation, how to identify VC camps by smell alone, the specific combination of cooking fires, human waste, and stored rice. They knew to patrol during rain because sound was muffled, and trails showed recent traffic clearly. They knew which plants indicated water sources, which trees provided best observation positions, which birds gave warning of human presence. This knowledge was institutional. It passed from veteran soldiers to new soldiers through training that sometimes lasted years. American troops received weeks of preparation, then deployed. They learned in combat, which meant early mistakes cost lives. By the time soldiers gained experience, their tours ended and replacements arrived, restarting the learning cycle. The Australians deployed squadrons on year-long rotations, but maintained 3-year enlistments. So experienced soldiers served multiple tours, building expertise that stayed institutional. The Australian SAS in particular represented elite capability that Americans respected but could not replicate. SAS selection was brutal. Candidates underwent months of physical and psychological testing. Endurance marches carrying 80-pound packs through Australian outback in 100-degree heat. Navigation courses where failure meant disqualification. Psychological evaluations that eliminated anyone lacking discipline, maturity, or judgment. Candidates were tested on ability to remain motionless for hours, endure isolation, resist interrogation, make split-second decisions under pressure. Fewer than 10% passed selection. Those who did joined units that prided themselves on professionalism, silence, and lethality. They called their approach silent running, operate so quietly that enemy forces never know you exist until you kill them. American Special Forces were excellent soldiers, but U.S. doctrine emphasized different skills. Navy SEALs trained. Army Special Forces trained for unconventional warfare, organizing indigenous forces. Neither specialized in long-duration reconnaissance patrols the way Australian SAS did. The closest U.S. equivalent was MACV SOG, the classified special operations group running missions into Laos and Cambodia. SOG personnel who worked with Australian SAS came away impressed. One SOG operator later recalled, "We thought we were quiet, then we saw Australians move through jungle. They vanished. Absolutely fucking vanished. We couldn't see them, couldn't hear them, couldn't track them. The VC must have been terrified." They were. Captured VC documents referred to Australian forces with respect bordering on fear. One document from 274th Regiment, written in late 1966 after several encounters with Australian forces, warned cadre, "The new enemy is different from Americans. They do not use helicopters constantly. They move silently and appear without warning. They do not fire artillery before attacks. They ambush trails weaken. They remain in areas for weeks. We cannot predict their movements. Fighters must exercise extreme caution near Australian positions. Another document from D445 Battalion in 1967 was more blunt. Australian patrols are phantoms. Avoid contact unless victory is certain. The psychological impact of this fear cannot be overstated. When enemy fighters are frightened, they make mistakes. They become cautious. They avoid areas. They lose initiative. Australian operations in Phuoc Tue province created no-go zones where Viet Cong moved only at night, stayed off trails, and avoided ambush sites. This restricted their operations, reduced their effectiveness, and increased their casualties without Australians firing shots. Statistics illustrate the difference. Australian forces in Vietnam, approximately 60,000 personnel total serving between 1962 and 1972, suffered 521 deaths. They killed an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 enemy fighters, producing kill ratios between 21 and 30, one for conventional units. SAS ratios were dramatically higher. Estimates range from 101 to 501 depending on methodology. One 3-month period in 1969 saw 2 SAS squadron kill 126 confirmed enemies while suffering 0 deaths and 2 minor wounds. American forces with far larger numbers and overwhelming firepower achieved kill ratios between 5-1 and 10. The difference was not courage. American soldiers fought bravely. The difference was doctrine. Americans sought contact, engaged heavily. Australians avoided unnecessary contact, ambushed perfectly, vanished. Americans measured success by battles fought. Australians measured success by intelligence gathered. Different philosophies, different results. The intelligence Australian SAS provided changed how 1st Australian Task Force operated and how US forces in adjacent provinces planned. When Morrison's patrol returned with detailed maps of VC taxation networks, analysts correlated data with signals intelligence, prisoner interrogations, and captured documents. They identified headquarters locations. They mapped courier routes. They predicted operational patterns. This enabled targeted operations that eliminated high-value personnel while minimizing civilian casualties. Traditional approach: saturate an area with troops, search everything, arrest suspects broadly. Australian approach: identify specific individuals through patient intelligence work, capture them surgically without large operations. One method alienated populations, the other built trust. The long-term strategic impact was incalculable. By mid-1968, Phuoc Tue province was the most secure province in 3 core tactical zone. Civilian casualties were lowest, economic development was highest, popular support for government was strongest. VC activity was minimal, roads were open, villages functioned normally. This was counterinsurgency success. Yet most Americans never learned these lessons. The Phoenix program, started in 1968 to target VC infrastructure nationwide, used similar concepts but implemented them poorly. Phoenix relied heavily on Vietnamese police and provincial forces, many corrupt or incompetent. It offered bounties for VC captures, incentivizing false accusations. It lacked the intelligence rigor Australians maintained. Phoenix neutralized tens of thousands of suspected VC, but infrastructure remained functional because many targets were innocents and real cadre escaped through corruption. Route 44 returned to normalcy by 1968. Farmers traveled freely, markets operated without taxation, truck drivers moved goods without paying VC tolls. To casual observers, nothing seemed different. The road looked the same, people behaved the same, but underneath, everything changed. The Viet Cong network that operated for years was gone. Collectors were arrested, killed, or defected. Couriers were... Supply chains were broken, money stopped flowing. The invisible system that funded insurgency in Phuoc Tue province was dismantled completely. American intelligence agencies studied Australian methods. Some lessons were implemented, many were ignored. The fundamental problem was institutional. American military culture valued decisive action, measurable results, and rapid timelines. Counterinsurgency requires patience, cultural sensitivity, and long-term commitment. These values conflicted with American approach. Senior officers rotated every 6 months to gain combat command experience for promotion. Enlisted soldiers rotated every 12 months, ensuring no continuity. Civilian agencies competed rather than coordinated. The bureaucracy was too large, too unwieldy, too focused on conventional metrics. The Australians operated differently because they were smaller, more flexible, and institutionally committed to lessons learned in Malaya. They came to Vietnam to win counterinsurgency war. Americans came to win conventional war using counterinsurgency tactics. The difference was subtle, but total. By 1971, when Australian forces withdrew, Viet Cong province remained peaceful. The success outlasted their presence because infrastructure was rebuilt, not just destroyed. Village governments functioned, police maintained order, economic development continued. When Americans withdrew in 1973 and North Vietnam invaded in 1975, Viet Cong fell like everywhere else, not because counterinsurgency failed, but because conventional invasion succeeded against forces abandoned by allies. The lessons learned in Viet Cong between 1966 and 1971 remained relevant decades later. When American forces fought insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan, some commanders studied Australian operations in Vietnam. Small unit tactics, intelligence-driven operations, cultural sensitivity, long-duration patrols, population-centric approach. The methods worked in Vietnam. They worked in Malaya. They worked in Iraq and Afghanistan. When the tragedy is how many lives were lost learning lessons that were already known. Sergeant Jack Morrison survived Vietnam. He returned to Australia in late 1967, trained new SAS recruits, deployed again in 1969, and retired in 1974. He never spoke publicly about specific operations. SAS culture valued silence, but men who served with him remembered. They remembered patrol discipline so extreme that coughs were suppressed for days. They remembered lying in ambush for 40 hours without moving while mosquitoes fed. They remembered tracking VC couriers for weeks through terrain that killed American patrols in days. They remembered killing efficiently, professionally, and without emotion. They remembered the taxonomy of terror they created, the fear that made enemies avoid entire regions. Most importantly, they remembered that their mission was not killing, it was intelligence. Understanding the enemy better than the enemy understood himself. Exposing networks others never knew existed. This was the Australian SAS in Vietnam, not warriors, though they fought ferociously when necessary. Not occupiers, though they held ground. Not conquerors, though they won. They were hunters. Patient, silent, lethal. They were intelligence operators who understood that information matters more than ammunition. They were counterinsurgency specialists who dismantled insurgent infrastructure with surgical precision. They were the soldiers who found what American intelligence could not. Route 44 still exists. It is paved now, crowded with motorcycles and trucks, lined with restaurants and shops. Tourists travel it without knowing its history. Farmers sell vegetables in markets that once hosted VC tax collectors. Old men sit in cafes that once served as dead-drop locations. The war is memory. The networks are forgotten. But for 3 years, this road was front line in an invisible war. A war of intelligence, taxation, infrastructure, and control. A war where four-man patrols mattered more than divisions. A war where patience defeated firepower. A war where Australians succeeded while Americans failed. The lessons remain. Insurgencies are not defeated by killing fighters. They are defeated by dismantling the systems that support fighters, by replacing shadow governments with functional governments, by gathering intelligence rather than dropping bombs, by understanding enemies as humans with motivations, fears, and vulnerabilities, rather than as targets to eliminate. These lessons cost tens of thousands of lives to learn in Vietnam. They were relearned in Iraq and Afghanistan at additional cost. Perhaps someday they will be institutionalized. Perhaps military forces will train for counterinsurgency with the same rigor they train for conventional war. Perhaps intelligence will receive the same resources as firepower. Perhaps patience will be valued as much as aggression. Until then, stories like Route 44 remind us. Small teams matter. Intelligence matters. Cultural understanding matters. Patience matters. Silence matters. The Viet Cong believed their taxation system was invisible. They believed their infrastructure was untouchable. They believed their networks were secure. They were wrong. 4 Australian SAS soldiers proved them wrong. Not with firepower, not with technology, not with overwhelming force. With patience, with observation, with silence, with understanding. If you want to learn more about operations like this, about the units that changed modern warfare, about the intelligence victories that never made headlines, subscribe to Vietnam War Records, hit that notification bell, and remember, the most important battles are often the quietest, the most valuable victories are often invisible, and the most effective warriors are often ghosts you never see coming.